It was a warm Sunday in late May, the kind where the sun hovers just long enough over the trees to convince you summer's already arrived. The Wren River had always been a quiet retreat for families. Gentle bends, shaded banks, and a stretch of grass near mile marker 19 where locals like to set up for the day. That's where Danielle Brooks, 28, had laid out a gingham picnic blanket that morning with her 2-year-old son, Noah, and her fiancé, Kevin Holtz. Danielle had packed sandwiches, cut fruit, and a small battery fan to keep the bugs off Noah. According to Kevin, it was supposed to be an easy afternoon, a short escape from the noise of their apartment in Eugene. Sometime around noon, Kevin told police he left the riverbank to walk back up to the car, a silver Ford Escape, to grab a portable speaker and some sunscreen. The car was parked less than a 4-minute walk away, but he says he lingered, scrolling through his phone for a bit once he got there. When he returned roughly 15 minutes later, the picnic spot was eerily still. The stroller stood right where he left it, wheels locked, pointed toward the river. Danielle's purse was still zipped shut. Her sandals were tucked neatly beside the blanket, as if she had stepped out of them to stretch her legs. Noah's stuffed rabbit, a threadbare off-white toy he rarely let out of his sight, lay face down on the blanket. But Danielle and Noah were gone. Kevin said he called out their names first, thinking maybe they'd wandered just behind the brush to look at birds or pick flowers. But there was no response. The park wasn't crowded, but there were a few other families nearby. No one had seen anything unusual. No screams, no splashes, no footsteps running. It was like they had dissolved into the quiet. By 1:30 p.m., Kevin called 911. His voice, recorded on the dispatch call, is frantic, stammering. He tells the operator his fiancée and her son are missing, possibly drowned. The dispatcher asks him to stay calm. Officers from the Lane County Sheriff's Office arrive within 25 minutes, and within the hour, the Riverside is sectioned off. Deputies find no signs of a struggle, no drag marks in the dirt, no broken branches, no signs of forced entry into the car. Kevin hands over Danielle's phone, which he said she left behind on the blanket. Noah's diaper bag is still half open with juice bottles and spare clothes untouched. Initial assumptions point toward the water. The Wren River may look calm from the bank, but undercurrents have pulled people under before. The sheriff's dive team is called in. They sweep the bend, searching underwater for clothing, small bodies, any trace of movement. Sonar reveals nothing. The river is cold, just above 50 degrees. Search dogs brought in by 5 p.m. hit on Danielle's scent for a short stretch, but lose it near a muddy footpath that disappears into thick brush. By nightfall, searchers switch to heat-sensing drones and thermal equipment. Nothing shows up. Danielle's car keys are found still clipped to the blanket, along with her ID, credit cards, and a mostly untouched lunch. For investigators, it's as if mother and child evaporated in broad daylight, just feet from their belongings. Kevin, questioned by deputies under the growing pressure of the missing person report, insists that Danielle would never go near the river with Noah alone. She had always been cautious, even a little anxious when it came to the water. She didn't swim. Noah was still in diapers, still scared of his own bathwater. He repeats this again and again. She wouldn't have taken him down there. But that's the problem. If they didn't go into the river, then where did they go? As daylight fades, officers begin interviewing nearby families. A couple picnicking 30 yards downriver reports hearing nothing unusual. No yells, no cries for help. A retired man walking his dog claims he saw the couple earlier in the day, said Danielle seemed quiet but not upset. And no one saw anyone leaving the area with a child. No suspicious vehicles, no strangers, no sudden departures. The only thing authorities are left with that night is absence. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Just a blanket, a stroller, a lunch half-eaten, and a stuffed rabbit lying in the grass. By the following morning, the Wren River was no longer just a quiet family picnic spot. It had become the center of a full-scale search operation. At first light, local deputies returned to the bend where Danielle Brooks and her son Noah had last been seen. Search and rescue teams arrived in unmarked trucks, bringing in canine units, sonar equipment, and thermal imaging drones. The area was sealed off beyond the main trailhead. A whiteboard was set up near the ranger's post with a map of the area, and every inch of it was gridded, numbered, and assigned. They worked outward in slow, methodical circles, beginning where the picnic blanket had been found. Danielle's phone remained locked in an evidence bag. Her sandals were still sitting beside the blanket, and the stuffed rabbit was now protected in a brown paper envelope marked as item number 004. The water was cold that morning, colder than it looked. The current wasn't strong, but it was steady, enough to pull small debris downstream, but not enough, according to veteran divers, to take two people without leaving some kind of trace. Still, they went in. Divers waded through the murky water in full suits, using poles and tactile search techniques in case the silt had buried something. They swept the entire bend for nearly 200 yards in both directions. Visibility was less than 2 feet. By noon, they'd found nothing. No clothing, no bodies, no drag marks into the water, nothing to suggest anyone had even entered it. On land, the dogs made initial progress. 2 cadaver dogs picked up scent trails, one following the river's curve, eastward for about 30 yards before veering toward a patch of dense brush. The other followed a similar path, but stopped suddenly at a muddy incline just behind the main trail. There, investigators found partial impressions in the soil, not footprints, more like broken weight marks, suggesting someone may have slid or stumbled, but the area was too degraded from overnight rain to collect prints. Still, something about that path stuck with the handlers. The dogs kept circling it, confused, as if the trail had been lifted out of the earth halfway through. Helicopters were ruled out due to low visibility that morning, but thermal drones were deployed by midday. They swept the forest edge, looking for residual heat signatures, in case someone was unconscious or injured. Every ping turned out to be a wildlife false alarm. There was no sign of Danielle or Noah, not in the woods, not in the water, not anywhere. By now, volunteers had begun to arrive, dozens of them, neighbors, old classmates, strangers from Eugene who'd heard about the case online. They brought bottled water, gloves, and cell phones. Some combed the nearby trail systems while others handed out flyers. The forest stretched for miles in both directions, and there was only one narrow road in or out. Deputies checked every parked vehicle along the shoulder. Nothing was out of place, no broken locks, no sign of a struggle. Everything looked normal. Kevin Holt stayed mostly near the ranger station. Detectives noted that he was cooperative, answered every question, never once refused to help. But there was something about him that didn't sit right. His story never changed, but the emotional range behind it felt strange, flat, controlled. One deputy wrote in her report that Kevin appeared more anxious about the investigation itself than about the condition of the victims. Still, grief shows up in ways that don't always make sense, and nothing in Kevin's background, no priors, no history of violence, suggested he posed any risk. He and Danielle had been together for just under 3 years. There were no police calls to their apartment, no signs of domestic tension on file. But as a matter of protocol, detectives obtained a warrant to search his car and apartment by late afternoon. The SUV was clean, almost too clean. The interior had been vacuumed recently, but there were no blood traces, no hair, no signs of forced removal. Danielle's fingerprints were found on the inside passenger handle. Noah's juice cup was still in the cup holder. Everything matched Kevin's version of the day, except for the time. Based on traffic cam data from the only access road to the river, Kevin's vehicle had exited the park and re-entered approximately 27 minutes later, longer than the 10 or 12 minutes he'd initially told officers. When asked about the discrepancy, Kevin said he stopped to scroll through his phone, then remembered the speaker and sunscreen, and didn't realize how long he'd been gone. He claimed he'd never left the car, just sat there with the engine running. Investigators confirmed that a gas station nearby had surveillance cameras, and they requested footage to check his story. It would take 48 hours to retrieve. By sunset, the dive team had halted their search, and a fresh wave of deputies took over the overnight surveillance. Search dogs were rotated out, drones were grounded to recharge, and command was handed over to Oregon State Police. Detectives admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. They were no longer just searching for a missing toddler and his mother. They were starting to consider something darker, something intentional. And the one thing they kept coming back to was how Danielle's scent, strong and consistent near the picnic blanket, just stopped. As if someone had removed her from that forest, like lifting a piece from a chessboard. Quietly and fast. By the second day, word of Danielle Brooks and her 2-year-old son Noah's disappearance had swept across Lane County like wildfire. News vans parked along the rural shoulder of Wren River Road, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Flyers bearing Danielle's smiling face and Noah's chubby cheeks were stapled to every trailhead sign, every gas station door, and every stop sign within 20 miles. Missing, they read in bold red letters. Last seen May 18th, near Wren River, mile marker 19. The town of Lowell, where the family lived, was small, the kind of place where people remembered your birthday and still left casseroles when someone was sick. And the thought that someone like Danielle, someone they knew, could just vanish in the middle of the day, didn't feel real. Volunteers came in waves. Some brought maps and flashlights. Others just showed up with work boots and hope. Over 70 people joined the second day's coordinated grid search. They formed human chains along the riverbanks, fanned out through the brush, and shouted Danielle's and Noah's names into the silence. Some called out with urgency, others with trembling voices that already feared the worst. They searched abandoned sheds, drainage ditches, even lifted the lids of trash bins. Anything was possible now, and that was what made it so terrifying. Police assigned a team to dig into Danielle's digital life. Her phone, recovered at the picnic site, was password locked but eventually accessed with Kevin's help. Her last known texts were benign. A grocery list to her sister the night before, a message to Kevin saying, "Bring sunscreen if you're stopping." Her recent Google searches included toddler-friendly lunch recipes, river safety tips, and a pair of preschool options in Eugene. There were no flagged messages, no evidence of a secret plan to leave. Bank activity was uneventful, the last transaction being a debit charge for gas 3 days prior. No ATM withdrawals, no large transfers. Her social media showed a happy, if quiet, family life. Photos of Noah playing with wooden blocks, Danielle smiling beside a homemade birthday cake. But as the circle widened, so did the questions. A neighbor from their apartment complex came forward late on the second night. She said she remembered something strange. A white panel van parked across the street from their building a week before the disappearance. No windows, no markings. She didn't think much of it at the time until she saw the flyers. Another neighbor corroborated seeing it, said the van idled there for nearly an hour before pulling away slowly. It was never seen again. Detectives reviewed traffic footage from surrounding streets but found nothing matching that van. It had either been careful to stay off main roads or someone had scrubbed the plates. Still, it was a lead, and the first that didn't point to the river. By the third day, investigators began re-interviewing everyone close to Danielle. One friend, a co-worker from her part-time bakery job, told police that Danielle and Kevin had argued 2 nights before the picnic. She didn't know the details, but remembered Danielle seemed off the next day. Quiet, distracted. Said she might cancel their weekend plans, but she didn't. She went anyway. The argument, according to Kevin, was nothing serious. He said they disagreed about moving out of the apartment. Danielle wanted to be closer to her sister in Springfield, but Kevin thought it was too expensive. When pressed further, he admitted that Danielle had felt trapped lately, overwhelmed with stay-at-home parenting, unsure about their future. He told detectives he thought the picnic might help reset things, give them a chance to talk, just the 3 of them. Investigators didn't say so aloud, but a shift had begun. If Danielle was feeling overwhelmed, if there had been tension in the relationship, if a stranger had been watching the apartment, any of these could reshape how this case was being viewed. An accident still hadn't been ruled out, but the idea that this had been a random drowning in a quiet river was no longer sitting cleanly with anyone. And then came the oddest detail, one so subtle it might have been missed entirely. During a review of the body cam footage taken at the river on day 1, an officer noticed something on the edge of the frame. Danielle's car keys, still on the blanket, were attached to a pink rubber keychain, a tiny baby sandal. But in photos from the family's apartment, that same keychain appeared broken and missing its strap. Somehow, between the time Danielle left the apartment and the time the keys were recovered, the damaged keychain had been replaced. It wasn't proof of anything. It wasn't even enough to confirm foul play. But it was something off, something that didn't fit. And in cases like this, it's the things that don't fit that often point to what everyone's missing. In every missing person's case, there comes a moment when the present doesn't hold enough answers, when investigators are forced to turn backward into a person's history, looking for cracks that might explain the sudden void. Danielle Brooks didn't have a criminal record, no history of addiction, no documented mental health concerns. To those who knew her, she was a cautious, kind, and fiercely attentive mother. But as investigators dug deeper, a name from nearly 6 years earlier surfaced, one that hadn't been spoken by anyone during the initial days of the search. His name was Travis Meeks. According to court records obtained from Multnomah County, Danielle had filed a restraining order against Travis in the spring of 2018. At the time, she was 21 and living in Portland, attending community college while working part-time at a bookstore. The relationship, according to the affidavit, had lasted less than 8 months. It ended abruptly after Danielle discovered messages on his phone referencing another woman. She told police he became controlling, manipulative, and once told her that if she ever left him, he'd make sure she knew what loss really felt like. The phrase had stuck with her. And years later, investigators reading that report would find themselves circling it in red ink. The order was granted for a period of 12 months, but there was no follow-up. Travis never contested it, and Danielle never reported further contact. The case file had been closed, marked with the quiet finality of a bureaucratic stamp. But now, in light of her disappearance, and Noah's, it no longer felt like a footnote. Using DMV records and public databases, detectives tracked Travis to a small town just across the California border, near Crescent City. He was living under his full name, working irregularly at a local salvage yard, and had no priors since the restraining order. 2 Lane County investigators were dispatched to question him in person. He appeared surprised to hear Danielle's name, claimed he hadn't seen or spoken to her since the breakup. When asked where he was on May 18th, he provided a signed time card from the yard and a co-worker who confirmed his presence there the entire day. The timestamps matched. Still, there were things that couldn't be proven. No digital contact had occurred between Danielle and Travis since 2018, but burner phones, encrypted apps, and social media accounts under aliases were always a possibility. The problem was, there wasn't a single shred of evidence linking him to the disappearance. Just a memory, a threat from years ago, and a name that Danielle had deliberately kept out of her life ever since. Investigators turned back to the data they could verify. In analyzing Danielle's phone records more closely, something stood out. Her phone had been recovered at the scene, inside her purse, powered off. Kevin had told officers she left it there when he walked to the car, intending to return in just a few minutes. But the cell tower logs told a slightly different story. At 12:42 p.m., nearly an hour after Kevin claimed to have left for the car, Danielle's phone pinged a tower nearly 4 miles upriver, well beyond the picnic area. The signal lasted just over 2 minutes before the phone went dark. It wasn't a rogue glitch. The tower's coverage radius was narrow, and the ping required active communication, either an incoming message, app activity, or passive location updating in the background. There were only 2 explanations. Either Danielle had her phone with her, and Kevin was lying, or someone else had taken it after she disappeared and moved it before turning it off. When Kevin was shown the tower data, he appeared genuinely confused. He insisted she hadn't taken the phone, that it was in her bag when he got back, untouched, but he couldn't explain the ping. Investigators asked if he might have moved the phone himself. He said no, asked if Danielle could have changed her mind, decided to leave with Noah, and walked off. Again, he said no. Danielle wouldn't leave a picnic blanket behind. She wouldn't leave without the car, and she wouldn't go anywhere without her keys, which were still lying right there. The forensics team confirmed the phone showed no signs of being reset or tampered with. Its GPS history supported the timeline: multiple pings in Eugene the day before, a 42-minute drive to Wren River, and then that final unexplainable signal upriver. Investigators revisited the original map of the area. There were only 2 footpaths leading in that direction. One was wide enough for emergency vehicles. The other, barely visible on satellite imagery, snaked through the trees parallel to the river, a trail only locals knew. Whatever happened that day, someone had moved, someone had taken something, or someone. And wherever Danielle and Noah went after that picnic, their path, however brief, had extended far beyond the edge of the blanket. By the 5th day of the investigation, Kevin Holtz's story began to quietly unravel. What had first sounded like a simple timeline, walk to the car, grab the speaker and sunscreen, come back, now had new holes, and they weren't small. Detectives had already discovered through traffic cams that Kevin's vehicle had left the picnic area that day and returned nearly 40 minutes later, not the 10 to 15 minutes he'd initially claimed. At first, he said he just sat in the car scrolling his phone. Then, under growing pressure, he revised the story. He told investigators he'd driven off, not far, just to a nearby gas station 6 miles east, to buy a bag of ice and a bottle of soda. It was a quick trip, he said, harmless. He thought Danielle and Noah would be fine for a few minutes. Surveillance footage obtained from the gas station confirmed that Kevin had been there. A timestamp showed him entering at 12:14 p.m., paying in cash for a bag of ice and a 20-ounce root beer. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't appear hurried, didn't seem anxious. He exited the store, placed the bag in the back seat, and then sat in the car for several minutes. According to the footage, he didn't leave until 12:28. Based on dashcam footage from the same time window, his SUV re-entered Wren River Road at 12:43, placing him back at the site just shy of 12:50 p.m. That meant Danielle and Noah were unaccounted for, and alone, for nearly 37 minutes. When confronted with the new timeline, Kevin didn't deny it. He looked down, nodded, and said he hadn't wanted to admit he'd left them that long, that he knew how bad it sounded. He told detectives he just needed air. Things have been tense lately. That Danielle had been moody and distant, and part of him just wanted a minute to breathe. That was his explanation. But no one was comforted by it. The deeper concern wasn't just the time gap, it was what could have happened during it. If Danielle and Noah were abducted, that window would have been the moment. But there was nothing, no signs of forced entry into the car, no screams reported, no tire tracks that didn't belong. The stroller was untouched, the food left half-eaten. Noah's juice bottle is still sealed. It didn't look like a scene that had exploded with panic. It looked like a scene that had gone still. Forensics returned to the site for a second sweep. They brought ground-penetrating radar, luminol spray, and a portable laser scanner to capture every square inch of terrain around the picnic site. Nothing turned up. No traces of blood, no signs of struggle. The dirt surrounding the blanket showed scattered impressions, but none were definitive. Too many volunteer boots had trampled the area on the first day. One technician noted a faint parallel drag in the dirt, only 18 inches long, maybe a toddler's heel. But even that couldn't be confirmed. Kevin agreed to a second interview without a lawyer. He admitted that he and Danielle had argued the night before the picnic, not just about money, but about something deeper. She'd been talking more often about needing space, about feeling like she couldn't breathe inside the life they'd built. He said they weren't breaking up, but it had been close. That morning, he thought the river would be a reset, a quiet place to smooth things over. But when detectives asked him how Danielle had seemed just before he left, if she looked distracted, nervous, scared, he said he couldn't remember, that she was looking down at her phone, or maybe just at Noah, that he didn't think much of it at the time. At that point, investigators began to weigh 2 competing possibilities. The first was grim but plausible. Someone had taken Danielle and Noah while Kevin was gone. An abduction, quick and silent, in a place with no cameras, no witnesses, and no resistance. The second was far more complicated, that something had happened before Kevin ever left, that Danielle was already gone, or hurt, or missing by the time he drove to that gas station. that the trip itself had been a way to build a timeline, to stage a discovery. But there was no proof of that. Not yet. No witnesses reported seeing Kevin with anyone else that day. No blood was found in his SUV. His clothing tested negative for DNA outside his household. He passed a polygraph test, though the results were later deemed inconclusive due to irregular breathing. There was no physical evidence to tie him to a crime, and no physical evidence of any crime at all. It was the silence that disturbed detectives the most. The stillness of that blanket, the uneaten food, the way the river, just yards away, had nothing to say. It had given up no bodies, no clothing, no signs that anything had been taken by force. In all their years on the job, investigators couldn't recall a scene that felt so undisturbed, and yet so deeply wrong. Something had happened in that 37-minute window, but what, or who, or how, remained a question with no sound, no shadow, and no shape. 12 days after Danielle Brooks and her son Noah vanished without a trace, the Wren River had grown quiet again. The helicopters were gone. The volunteers, exhausted and heartbroken, had trickled back to their homes. Law enforcement had scaled back operations, shifting from active search to investigation mode. But then, on a foggy Tuesday morning, a man named Wesley Carver, a retired park ranger and longtime resident of the area, made a call that would pull the case violently back into motion. Wesley had been fishing near a bend just downstream from mile marker 19, about half a mile from where the family's picnic blanket had been found. He came often to that spot, said the fish bit better there when the water was slow and the air still. As he pulled his line from the water, he noticed something lodged in the muck near the exposed roots of a leaning birch tree. At first he thought it was a piece of trash, maybe a child's toy or torn glove, but when he stepped closer, he saw what it was. A tiny shoe, caked in silt, the fabric fraying around the edges. It was red and navy with a small rubber tab on the heel, the kind made for toddlers learning to walk. The sheriff's office confirmed within hours that the shoe matched the brand and size Noah had been wearing the day he disappeared. A photograph released to the press early in the investigation showed Noah in a nearly identical pair sitting on Danielle's lap. The tread was compared against footprints found in their apartment hallway, and the pattern matched. It was his. There was no doubt. Search teams immediately returned to the river, focusing all efforts downstream. Divers resumed grid sweeps. Drones were launched again, combining the tree canopy and shallow tributaries. But there was no sign of Noah's body. No shirt, no shorts, no second shoe. The water level had dropped slightly due to a dry week, exposing more of the riverbank, but it offered no answers. Just more silence. The forensics team collected the shoe and sent it to the state crime lab for testing. No blood was found, no hair, no skin cells. Whatever journey the shoe had taken, whether carried by current, discarded intentionally, or dropped in a struggle, it had left no clue of what happened to the boy who'd worn it. But it shifted the investigation. Until that moment, there had still been some clinging hope, however small, that maybe Danielle had taken Noah and left, that perhaps she'd snapped, fled from her life, vanished by choice. But children don't abandon their own shoes in the mud. Children that age don't leave anything behind unless they're made to. That afternoon, canine teams were brought in for a fresh sweep, focusing on a wider radius near the shoe's discovery site. One of the dogs, a 9-year-old bloodhound named Vesper, picked up something faint near the water's edge and followed it inland. The trail was erratic, fading in and out, but led handlers across a slope of loose rock and into a patch of tall grass where they found an old deer trail, nearly invisible to the naked eye. It was narrow, sunken from years of animal use, but it curved upward toward an area no one had searched before, a patch of timber just outside the original search grid, leading away from the river and back toward a gravel utility road. The location raised immediate questions. If someone had taken Noah, and possibly Danielle, they could have used that trail to exit the park by foot, avoiding the main paths entirely. The terrain was steep but passable, and while the trail didn't connect directly to a road, it came within 200 feet of a service gate used only by forestry personnel. There were no cameras, no witnesses. Detectives walked the route themselves, noting every possible hiding place, every broken branch, every flattened patch of grass. But there were no signs of human habitation, no wrappers, no cigarette butts, no items of clothing. Just forest, still and withholding. But the theory began to solidify. If someone had been watching them, waiting for a moment when Danielle and Noah were alone, that narrow window Kevin created when he left for the gas station might have been long enough. If the abductor was on foot, knew the terrain, and moved fast, they could have carried the boy out and disappeared before Kevin ever made it back. Danielle's fate in that scenario remained unclear, but the single shoe told them one thing with certainty. Something had happened downriver. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a heartbreak. For Danielle's sister, who had held out hope that they were alive somewhere, it marked the first real blow of confirmation that this was no accident. For Kevin, it deepened the scrutiny. If foul play had occurred, why hadn't he noticed anything? Why had he really left for so long? And for investigators, it raised the most painful question yet. If someone had taken Noah, where were they now? And why had only one shoe come back with the current? 2 nights after Danielle Brooks and her son Noah vanished from the banks of the Wren River, a Union Pacific freight train crossed a trestle bridge just south of Millstone Gulch, a remote stretch of track that cut through dense forest and hadn't seen a passenger in years. The conductor, a man named Dwight Keller, noticed something strange just before the bridge, a figure near the edge of the woods standing barefoot beside the gravel service road that ran parallel to the tracks. He slowed slightly, unsure if he was seeing a person or a shadow. The figure turned its head, then walked unsteadily toward the tree line. He assumed it was a hiker who'd gotten lost, maybe drunk, maybe disoriented. But when news broke 2 days later about the woman and child missing from Wren River, something about the posture, the bare feet, and the way she turned away from the light came back to him. He made the call. Detectives from Lane County followed up within the hour. The area Dwight had described was miles off the main hiking routes, with no maintained access. It was steep, thorny, and disused. No campsites, no known shelters. Deputies hiked in on foot, guided by GPS coordinates and the conductor's best estimate. It was hard terrain, overgrown, riddled with animal paths and erosion. But eventually, they reached the trestle bridge. Just below it, snagged in a roll of rusted barbed wire that had collapsed along a property line, they found it. A scrap of fabric, pale blue with a thin white floral pattern. A forensic tech photographed it in place before collecting it. Danielle had worn a blue blouse that day, multiple friends confirmed it, and the floral stitching was a match to what she'd been wearing in a recent family photo. The fabric was sent to the state crime lab under rush processing. Investigators hoped for blood, sweat, hair, anything that could prove Danielle had been there. But the results came back frustratingly neutral. No usable DNA. The material had been soaked by rain, contaminated by bacteria, and exposed to sunlight for nearly a week before it was recovered. There wasn't enough cellular structure left to match it conclusively to Danielle. It couldn't be ruled in, but it couldn't be ruled out either. Still, the location raised more questions than it answered. That stretch of forest wasn't connected to the Wren River picnic area. It sat more than 3 miles east across uneven elevation, with no footpath linking the two places. If Danielle had reached that area on her own, barefoot and disoriented, she would have had to cross a ravine, scale a 10-foot embankment, and pass through dense undergrowth. It was hard to imagine her making that journey alone, let alone with a toddler. Investigators considered several possibilities. Maybe Danielle had escaped an abductor and fled barefoot through the woods. Maybe she'd been dropped off there and left to wander. Or maybe someone had led her there deliberately, away from the water, away from help, toward isolation. If that was the case, the question became chillingly simple. Why bring her that far, and not finish the job there? Cadaver dogs were deployed along the tracks and surrounding gulch. They alerted briefly near a runoff trail but didn't hold the scent. A creek ran through the base of the gulch, but it was shallow, and nothing was found in its flow. Thermal drones scanned the area at night, detecting only deer and the occasional coyote. Interviews were conducted with 2 nearby property owners, both older men who hadn't seen or heard anything out of place. No other clothing was recovered, no signs of Noah. Just that one piece of torn fabric, caught like a whisper in the fence. Investigators brought the sighting back to Kevin, asking if Danielle had ever visited that part of the county. He shook his head. They had no connection to the area, no friends out there, no reason to ever pass through. But he latched onto the idea of the woman being Danielle, pleading with detectives to believe she had escaped, that she was alive, walking, looking for help. But if that were true, why had no one else seen her since? Why did she leave no trail, no footprints, no second sighting? Eventually, the search around Millstone Gulch was scaled back. Deputies marked the bridge on their internal maps but admitted quietly that they were chasing shadows. They had no camera footage, no witnesses except a conductor with a blurry memory, and no forensic certainty that the fabric even belonged to Danielle. But deep down, they couldn't shake it. A barefoot woman walking alone near a place no one would ever stumble across by accident. A ripped blouse, a fence that had gone untouched for years. It didn't feel like a coincidence. And for investigators who had spent nearly 2 weeks trying to make sense of the quiet where Danielle and Noah had vanished, that sliver of cloth, silent and weathered, felt like the first scream. 22 days after Danielle Brooks vanished from a riverbank in Oregon, a body surfaced. It was a man piloting a small aluminum skiff who spotted it, a bloated, pale shape caught in the shallow reeds where the Wren River began to widen and lose speed near a bend known as Fisherman's Cove. At first, he thought it was a deer. The limbs were contorted, the clothing nearly gone. But as he drifted closer, he realized what he was seeing. A human body, badly decomposed, tangled in weeds. He dropped his paddle and made the call. Sheriff's deputies were on scene within the hour, and the state medical examiner's office arrived shortly after. The body, recovered with care to preserve what little evidence remained, was female. Waterlogged, skeletal in places. Much of the soft tissue was gone, eaten away by time and current. She wore only the remains of an undergarment and one sock, stretched and clinging to a foot that no longer held definition. In her right hand, curled and locked by the stiffness of death, was a small strip of cloth. Investigators wouldn't notice it until the body was fully examined. It was wedged deep between 2 fingers, almost as if it had been hidden there, clutched tightly at the final moment. The fabric was old, frayed, and faded, a pale yellow with faint blue stars. It didn't match the remnants of her clothing. It didn't appear to come from her shirt, pants, or undergarments, but it looked eerily familiar. Danielle's dental records confirmed the identity within 24 hours. There was no question. The woman pulled from the river was her. It ended the speculation, the lingering hope that she might have fled or been in hiding. Danielle was gone, but the condition of her body only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, no fractures to the ribs, no evidence of stabbing or gunfire. But her right wrist was broken, not shattered, but fractured in a way consistent with bracing against a hard impact or resisting a violent pull. Defensive in nature. There were bruises on the bone near the forearm, indicators of deep tissue trauma, even if the flesh had long since deteriorated. Toxicology was inconclusive. Too much time had passed. The river had washed away anything that might have lingered in her system. The forensic report stated clearly, no definitive cause of death could be determined, and even more haunting, there was no sign of Noah. The blanket scrap in her hand was tested next. Technicians expected to find Noah's DNA on it. After all, he'd carried a yellow and blue blanket almost everywhere, according to family. It was described in detail in Danielle's missing persons report. But lab results came back clean. No trace of Noah, no trace of Danielle either. Just mixed environmental DNA, moss, algae, bacteria. The fabric had been in the water, likely for days. But whose it was or where it came from couldn't be confirmed. For detectives, the implications were devastating. Danielle had likely died not long after she vanished. The state of her body was too advanced for survival beyond a few days, but the strip of cloth, clearly not part of her own clothing, suggested she hadn't died alone. Someone had been with her. Someone had given her, or left near her, something small enough to clutch as she died. A piece of something that might have belonged to a child. The river had carried her nearly 14 miles, bypassing multiple bends, rocks, and fishing spots. How she ended up that far down was unclear. One theory proposed that her body had been moved upstream and placed in the water days after her death, accounting for the lack of animal activity or decomposition consistent with 22 days submerged. But without hard evidence, it remained speculation. Kevin Holtz was notified by detectives in person. He broke down on his porch, according to the officer's report, and could not speak for several minutes. He asked only one question. Was Noah with her? When told no, he reportedly stared at the floor and said, "Then this isn't over." Public response to the discovery was overwhelming. Candlelight vigils were held in 3 towns. Danielle's sister, Megan, posted a message on social media asking the public to please not forget Noah. The toddler, once the quiet center of Danielle's world, was now missing without a trace. No blanket, no clothing, nobody. Not a single confirmed sighting since the day they disappeared. The image that remained with everyone, investigators, family, even those who'd never met her, was that of Danielle's hand, locked in death, holding a strip of cloth no one could explain. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't even a clue in the traditional sense. But it was something. Something she hadn't let go of, even in her final moments. And for detectives working the case, that single strip of fabric marked the line between what had been found and what, heartbreakingly, still hadn't. It was late June when a man named Andrew Mercer, a delivery driver from Eugene, reached out to the Lane County Sheriff's Office. He wasn't calling as a witness, not at first. He was organizing old dashcam files for insurance purposes when he came across footage from the day Danielle and Noah disappeared. He'd stopped briefly at the Wren River parking lot that afternoon to take a break and eat his lunch. He hadn't noticed anything strange at the time, hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't even gotten out of the car. But as he scrubbed through the playback, a shape caught his eye. Just a few seconds, maybe less, but enough to raise questions. He paused the frame, and that's when he made the call. Detectives reviewed the footage the next morning. The quality was poor, shaky, backlit, and partially obscured by a tree branch swaying in the breeze. But there was no doubt. A figure stood just inside the tree line, motionless. He wasn't interacting with anyone. He wasn't moving. Just standing, watching. His posture was straight, his build narrow but tall, easily over 6 feet. He wore a greenish-brown jacket that looked dated, military style, with squared shoulders and long sleeves. The resolution was too low to see a face, but there was something in the way he stood that made the hairs rise on every detective's neck. The timestamp placed him there at 12:47 p.m., just 4 minutes before Kevin's car re-entered the lot. That single clip reframed everything. Until then, the case had revolved around 2 possibilities: Kevin's timeline and Danielle's potential escape. But now there was a third, someone unaccounted for, someone unknown, present just minutes before Danielle and Noah were discovered missing. Investigators launched a quiet canvassing operation. They revisited old leads and asked surrounding homes and businesses if anyone else had dashcam or security footage from the 18th. Nothing surfaced, no new angles, no additional sightings of the man. They turned inward. The image prompted detectives to revisit all male suspects previously considered. Danielle's former boyfriend, Travis Meeks, had already been interviewed weeks earlier. He was ruled out by time card records and surveillance from his workplace in Crescent City. But they pulled his file again anyway. Meeks was under 6 feet, had gained weight in recent years, and had a visible limp due to an old injury. He didn't match the figure's height or movement. 2 transient individuals who occasionally camped near the area were also re-examined. One had been seen around the Wren River access road in April, a man in his 50s who collected cans and was known to wear military surplus. He was located in a neighboring county and questioned. His alibi, confirmed by a church-run food bank, placed him 40 miles away on the day of the disappearance. The second, a man known only as Rick, hadn't been seen in months. Local deputies distributed sketches and reached out to other jurisdictions, but no one matching the profile emerged. The case, once narrow, was beginning to fray again. But one thing stood out. Kevin had insisted from the very beginning that he hadn't seen anyone unusual in the park that day. No strangers, no loitering. But the figure in the dashcam footage was visible from the main trail, positioned exactly where the tree line meets the edge of the slope, partially visible through the foliage, a place where someone might stand to watch without being easily noticed. Investigators returned to Kevin's statement and asked again. He stuck to his story. No strangers, no one was around. Either he hadn't seen the man, or he wasn't willing to say that he had. With Danielle's body found and the cause of death still undetermined, the case now revolved entirely around Noah, the missing toddler, the one who hadn't washed ashore, who hadn't been buried, who'd left no evidence of injury, struggle, or escape. If the man in the jacket was involved, if he had taken Noah, then the boy might still be alive. That thought became a quiet obsession among the investigative team. They studied the height of the figure, his stance, the slight lean of his shoulders. Behavioral analysts were consulted. One said the way the man held himself suggested planning, not aimless wandering, that he wasn't looking for a place to hide, but waiting for something to begin. Detectives knew the odds. In most missing child cases, time was the enemy. And yet, the dashcam footage had reopened the door. If someone had taken Noah, had watched from the trees, timed their move for when Danielle was alone, then perhaps the toddler had been carried out through the woods, through the deer trail, through the gulch. And maybe, just maybe, he'd never seen the river at all. And so investigators asked themselves a question they hadn't dared to out loud, not since the search had shifted from missing persons to recovery, not since the shoe was found and the woman had washed ashore. The question was this: if the man in the footage had taken Noah, if he'd slipped through that quiet forest and vanished, then was it possible that somewhere out there, the boy was still being kept? The heat of summer gave way to the cooling winds of September, and with it, the search for Noah Brooks quietly changed. In the early days, there had been urgency. K-9 units sweeping the woods, deputies combing creek beds, helicopters circling wide arcs over endless trees. But now, 4 months later, the pace has slowed. The posters were still up, fading at the corners. The reward fund remained active, but donations had trickled off. There had been no new sightings, no calls, no remains, just the occasional tip that drifted in, followed by a quiet dismissal. Nothing had brought investigators closer. And yet, something about the boy's absence refused to settle. It clung to the case, like fog that wouldn't lift. The strip of blanket Danielle was found holding became the last tangible link to anything new. It was damaged, water-worn, but forensic technicians traced the stitching pattern and fabric source. It was from a small batch manufacturer that had stopped producing the pattern over a decade ago. Not sold in stores, not part of any major brand, only distributed directly to a handful of outreach programs, mostly in Oregon and Northern California. One of those programs was a transitional shelter called Haven Reach, located 2 towns east of where Danielle's body had washed ashore. It served low-income families, veterans, and displaced persons. Most of the residents came and went quietly, no names shared unless necessary. It had burned to the ground 7 weeks earlier in a fire still under investigation. Detectives made the drive out to what remained, a collapsed skeleton of brick and blackened timber. They spoke with local fire marshals, reviewed the incident report, and interviewed volunteers who had helped run the shelter. That's when they met Tasha Lindley, a part-time kitchen assistant who'd worked there sporadically until just before the fire. She remembered the blanket, said she'd seen several like it handed out during cold weather distribution events. But what made her pause, what made her lower her voice and lean in, was the memory of a man. Middle-aged, quiet, polite, came in twice the week before the fire, always near closing time, once alone, once with a little boy. Tasha couldn't swear to the identity of the child, but she remembered the eyes, wide, unblinking. The child didn't speak, didn't smile, just clung to the man's leg and held something, maybe a toy or a rag. She thought it might have been a blanket, faded yellow, maybe blue stars. When investigators showed her a photo of Noah, she hesitated, said it might have been him, but she wasn't sure. The child she saw looked smaller, thinner. But the eyes, she said again, were right. That kind of stillness doesn't fade easily. The hope was short-lived. The shelter had 2 outdoor cameras. Both had been destroyed in the fire. The DVR box, which stored footage locally, was fused to a support beam and melted beyond recovery. No backup files, no license plate, no name signed on the visitor sheet. Whoever the man was, if he had been there, he had left no record. Investigators tried canvassing nearby stores and service stations, looking for overlapping surveillance, but nothing surfaced. The fire had erased whatever proof may have existed. The timing of the fire itself raised eyebrows. Just 7 weeks after Danielle's body was found, 3 days after the tip about the blanket was entered into the system, the shelter's fire marshal listed the cause as undetermined, but noted evidence of an accelerant near the back entrance. It wasn't conclusive, but it wasn't natural either. The investigation into the blaze went nowhere. There were no arrests, no leads, just a deepening void where answers should have been. Kevin Holtz moved out of Eugene shortly after Danielle's funeral. He didn't speak to the press. His social media accounts went dark. Danielle's sister took over the public side of the case, managing the reward fund, answering media inquiries, keeping Noah's name in circulation. She posted photos every week, usually the same ones. Noah on his tricycle, Noah wearing sunglasses too big for his face, Noah sleeping beside Danielle's shoulder. Each post ended with the same question: have you seen him? Inside the sheriff's office, Noah's photo remains pinned to the wall of the Major Crimes Unit. A simple 5x7 image, his face framed by messy curls and a faint grin. Beside it, a laminated copy of Danielle's autopsy summary. Most detectives have transferred to other cases, but every so often, one returns to the file. They reread the interview transcripts, flip through the photos, and replay the dashcam clip of the man in the jacket. They stare at the fabric sample. They still don't know who he was, or where he went, or why Danielle's hand, after days in the river, never let go of that one strip of cloth. The case remains open, but unofficially cold. A quiet kind of cold, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but lingers. There are no more updates, no vigils planned. The forest is green again. The river runs slow. And Noah Brooks, just 2 years old, remains a child without a grave. A boy whose name is still spoken in low voices by officers who don't forget. A missing person who may still be alive, or maybe not. A question trapped between what was seen and what washed ashore.